Welcome in, everyone. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Pleased to have you here today for a conversation that'll be about a really interesting topic here. It's media literacy with respect to social media, teaching our middle schoolers and high schoolers the skills they need to evaluate information in this digital age. My guest is Roy Whitehurst. Roy is a former CIA analyst and instructor who spent 30 plus years evaluating written information, photos, videos, and other media collected by the CIA and taught media literacy skills to new analysts at the CIA. He argues that anyone can learn how to evaluate the accuracy, credibility, logic, and argumentation of posts on social media. You don't have to be a CIA analyst to do so. And in fact, he believes that these skills are really critical for us to engage in a civic discourse and build a stronger democracy. Roy's new book is called Teaching Media Literacy with Social Media News, Practical Techniques for Middle and High School Classrooms. Roy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start right here. What motivated you to write the book? And it was after your career there, your main career at least, and now you're into a new type of work. But yeah, what kind of brought this issue onto your radar about the skills and the importance for students and motivated you to be the one to write it?
Well, thanks for that question. Really, when I was an analyst at the agency for over 30 years, I also was an instructor. And as your listeners probably know, the CIA collects a lot of media, overseas media, in our case, with our mission. And so the skills that I was teaching these new hires was, and that I practiced in my career was analyzing the media, right, in all forms and making sense of it and evaluating its credibility and then communicating that to our policymakers in Washington. So I got to thinking as I was teaching these classes that these are sharp CIA recruits that recruit, but they do have a hard time understanding what's credible media. And I got to thinking as I was doing this, you know what? I'm going to retire in a few years, and I bet you that I can sort of dovetail these skills into unclassified media and help the general population. In particular, though, middle and high schoolers, I think it's important that they get a handle on this skill for the 21st century. So that's where I got started. During the pandemic, I actually began to flesh out a book. I didn't know where it would go or if it would get any traction. And then what really got me motivated, though, was my niece, my wife's niece, who is a teenager, actually 17 at the time, and said, you know what? I asked her, where do you get your news? TikTok. And I thought, well, TikTok's great for many things and probably does have some good news outlets on there, but it raised red flags that, that's not the most reliable place. And so that generally motivated me. And now, of course, with the rise of all the inaccurate, inflammatory information on social media, the boundaries, between fact and opinion and persuasion, it's just harder and harder for any of us really to parse that out. And then as readers may surmise, your listeners probably realize, this is really a threat to democracy. I think this is the really motivator for me, that if people in general, and starting again with the teenagers, if they cannot determine what's fact and what's opinion and what's persuasion, they cannot engage in civic discourse effectively. And I think that's a threat to our democracy. So that's why I got into this. And really, to put a final point on it, I really think that I'm trying to teach people how to think. Not what to think, but how to think. And so that's what motivated me to really write the book. And then fortunately, I was able to get this published. And now I'm trying to spread the word.
Yeah. Yeah, and with evaluating the information, if we're talking about, in this case, the social media platforms and any digital platforms, there's kind of different layers, right? There's the medium overall, the platform, the source of the information, and then that individual piece. And each one of them requires some evaluation. It seems to me, even just for my own use, and I'm not as much of a power user as some people, but that the velocity of the information is one of the really challenging things, right? That it's almost like
Yeah.
it can be like subliminal messaging that you know you're looking at 10 different things and a bunch of them might be totally credible, but one or two sneaks in there that has inaccuracies or whatever, and at the end you can't, your brain can't disaggregate what was what, and it's just it all went in there somewhere, and you picked up what you picked up. But how important is it when starting out for users and students or anybody to understand what the platform is that they're engaging in, how that platform works, right? What the algorithms are, and all those type of things that, you know, how they interact with user behavior as kind of an initial point of understanding why am I being given whatever I'm being given, and then we get into evaluating what that content is, right? But at
Mhm.
first, I think a lot of people don't really understand that, and and
Yeah.
those algorithms have picked up really quickly when social media first rolled out that it wasn't really built that way, right? And
Sure.
now it can really be hard, I think, for even quite informed people to understand the level to which these sites are really built around those algorithms and feeding people information based on their behavior, and that it's not just anybody would see the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Russ. I mean, I like to say, and you've heard this statement, that if you're not paying for it, you're the product yourself. And so students need to understand that. Really, we all do that. Sometimes we forget that we're probably not paying for reading social media, right? But we're the product, and I would argue that every post is trying to persuade us, either, not usually in profound ways, but if nothing else, it wants us to engage. And I think, as some of your listeners know, these algorithms that are behind all of these platforms are designed to keep us on the platform, right? Not to leave the platform. And then they want us to be in silos, right? So silos meaning of information. So the minute we click on that TikTok video of, I don't know, the ice bucket challenge from years ago, they're going to give us more of that. Or if we click on something going on in Ukraine, they're going to give us more of that. And that's well and good, right? The problem is that it doesn't always give us a wide variety of sources.
Yeah.
And so I think the silo, and so I think students and all of us really, but students starting out might not realize that. And I think that they think, oh, this is a harmless video. A lot of them are on TikTok, and they're looking at influencers, which are, if they're selling something, they need to disclose that. If they're doing a product review, they need to disclose that. And a lot of times they don't do that. And it's hard to parse that out. So I think students do need to understand that they're the product, and they may go, well, I'm not a product, I'm just watching a video. Well, but you are. It may not be selling you anything, but it may be trying to engage you to watch more of them, because a lot of these influencers, talk about influencers because that's what they tend to watch a lot of. They are often paid or something to promote a product. So I think it is important they understand that it's an algorithm that keeps them there, and that how do they get out of it? Well, they have to consciously go to other sources. And we're all in a hurry. Yeah. And I would argue that we shouldn't be in such a hurry. We get so much social media feeds, so much in our feeds, that I think that we don't allow ourselves to slow down and to really evaluate something before we share it. And so I think we need to do that. And I think that would then enable us to then examine the media more closely. Not an easy thing to do, but that's what I would argue.
Yeah, and it's also can be fatiguing because it really is a near constant process, right? I mean, even I would love to have you speak about the differences between disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation, and how
Hmm.
those are defined. But I think even often, certainly within the limitations and parameters of social media and
Yeah.
brief content, things that are need to be summarized, or you put a caption on a video or whatever, that typically trustworthy or well-intentioned sources can sometimes be misleading, right? Because
Yeah.
they need to put a brief description on something that they're sharing and it's not exactly right. Or I'm sure anybody who's spent any time online in any capacity knows that that the headline of a story isn't always representative of exactly what the story is, and some people don't read past the headline, and then they're either taking the wrong message from it, or they're arguing about how the story is bad because but they didn't actually read the story, or all these different things. But the fact that it's not as black and white as some sources are reliable, others aren't. Some, sources have positive intent, others don't. There are certainly, I would, sources that have the intent to misinform, but it's not always that simple in it. So it really does require being on alert at all times, being conscientious about, as you said, before you share something, right? Now, okay, I'm putting my name on this in some way because I'm sharing it. Am I sharing something that's reliable or not? But can you
Yeah.
talk about those, like that disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and why why those distinctions matter? And I think that'll also connect to as we get into what the skills look like to
Sure.
identify.
Yeah, well, misinformation, the way it's generally defined, is it's media that is of any type that's usually false or misleading, but it's not created on purpose to be misleading or to harm anyone or anything. It's just sort of by accident, right? So I would say that if we share something that is incorrect or false, most of the time we're not doing it to hurt anybody, right? Or intentionally. We think it's true. And so we just label it as misinformation. Um, Disinformation, on the other hand, is something that's intentionally spread. False or misleading information that's intentionally spread and is deliberately created to influence or even to harm someone. It's not usually that alarmist, but it could be, right? It's usually done to make money, make political gain, have some kind of power, and it's done for that reason. Malinformation is based on fact, but it's used out of context, to mislead or harm. In other words, like editing a video to remove important context, often maybe because there's not enough time to put the whole video in. Like, so they edited, I think you mentioned, Ross alluded to this, that they elect to include certain context
Mhm.
and leave out. And that can lead to malinformation where some key information is left out that causes, the context is left out, it causes miscommunication or it leads to some impact that is not desirable. And so that's how I would define the three types there.
Yeah.
And I think students, it's not so important. It's important for students and alls to know that there's information out there that's disinformation or misinformation, but I'm less concerned about the two distinctions as I am just for people to be aware that some information is wrong or it's slanted or has a certain political bent to it, right? And that's inevitable. And I think it's healthy in some ways for social media outlets to have different viewpoints as long as we take advantage of consuming them, right?
Yeah, I think there certainly is a lot of value in people training themselves, really, right? And
Yeah.
pushing themselves to go out of their comfort zone and to make sure they are encountering different sources of information, different viewpoints. It doesn't mean that all of those sources are equally legitimate, but it gives you context and contrast to say, okay, now I can understand what the bias is here, but it also allows me to see where there is some bias in this other information that I like. And it doesn't, bias also doesn't necessarily mean it's illegitimate or inaccurate, but it means there's some selectivity, right, in what part of the story I'm choosing to tell or which stories I'm choosing to pick up versus not. And there could be, you know, bias by omission, right? Well, I'm not going to cover that one because it's a negative story about somebody I like or a positive story. So it doesn't mean that this other one that I wrote about or recorded a video about is not legitimate, but it means that I need to have the context for what information is not out there, what questions aren't being asked. And I think it does make anyone just a more savvy consumer of what they're consuming. And it can be, I mean, I don't know what you can maybe speak to if there's a lot of hope for that happening, because there can be certainly with the media ecosystem, the social media ecosystem, an asymmetrical playing field when it comes to when you're dealing with certain sources that may be intentionally misinforming,
Hmm.
right, or disinforming, and then those who are trying to be impartial and imbalanced, it's not really an effective counterweight sometimes to that, or when you're really intending to have the appearance of impartiality, when somebody lies and then it's written up as this perspective is in dispute or whatever, right? It's like, well,
Yeah.
it's actually not. It's actually just not true. Now, you don't want to be accused of bias by saying that, so you're painting it as that it's an opinion versus it's a fact. And even I'm thinking about today, I saw a video and it was only a part of, a clip of some remarks that were given, right? And while knowing the speaker and understanding the person's history, and I felt pretty confident based on the clip that I could surmise what it was all about. I also knew, hell, I really would have liked to see what happened in the minute before this part or the minute after
Yeah.
to really be 100% confident that this wasn't taken out of context. It really, so while I internalized, okay, what I think I took out of it, it's not something that I would then share or pass along to somebody else because I'm not totally sure, right? But that might be, that might be an ineffective counterweight
Hmm.
to somebody else who would take an equivalent video and share it thoughtlessly or, because they thought it was proving a point and not realize, well, there's you just can't be sure unless you see the entire thing and you're able to evaluate.
Yeah, it's an exhausting process, and I really advocate for a news media diet. I don't think that people should be, and I think there's reports out there now that people are cutting back on news consumption, whether social media or not, and for good reason. First of all, it's usually bad news, right, or portrayed as bad news because that gets more clicks, and I think we're wired to protect ourselves, and we like to know about bad news. We don't find good news to be a threat, right? So,
Mm.
but I think that contributes to cynicism and just, depression in some cases. But so I advocate a news media diet. I don't advocate abandoning consumption of news. I think for our democracy to survive, we need to be engaged with it. But I think we need to do it in a way that is measured and that we're making sure that we consume a variety of news sources, even the ones that we already think we disagree with. It's good to get the perspective. It does take time. There's no doubt about it. But I would say listeners should not share something that they haven't evaluated or that they're not sure of. Now, if it's a cat video, okay, fine. If it's wrong, if it's fake, no harm done, right? But I think we have to be careful not to share things that may potentially distort or harm somebody or lead to miscommunication. And I think it's better just to not share it if we're not sure. So, and of course, social media platforms are designed to get us to share, and people go on there to do that. And I think we have to just be very careful when it comes to news that we don't inadvertently share something that we haven't evaluated.
Yeah, and understanding and so much that the algorithms are based on engagement and it's not differentiating between positive or negative engagement, right? So if something is meant to provoke a reaction and a lot of people maybe like it and share it, but a lot of other people are engaging with it because they're unhappy about it, that ultimately it's registering all of that as interest versus something else that might be very informative, but not reaction provoking, and it's not going to
Yeah.
show up as often. Part of that is just understanding, okay, there's some underlying reasons why this content might be showing up in my feed. But another piece of it is knowing yourself, right, and knowing how the behaviors that you have on the channel is leading to the things that you see. I've heard from, this has nothing, from executives at a company who will say, "Oh, I keep seeing, my feed is always all I'm seeing is stuff from our competitors on, my feed."
Yeah.
Well, is it because you are clicking on their pages and engaging with their stuff, or does the algorithm know that you work for a competitor of theirs, so it's grouping you or people that work in you same company, right? And that you can't overgeneralize that and say, well, that obviously means they're being really effective because that's what everybody else must be seeing.
Hmm.
But also, well, this is why it's happening, right? And that's a case of it. It's not even about necessarily evaluating the information, but understanding how the platform works. And this is why I'm seeing this. And now I have that context and I can appropriately react to it versus drawing a different conclusion.
Yes. Yep.
So what are some of the skills? So when we get into, all right, now I'm headed into this. I want to be better at media literacy. I want to better
Mhm.
understand and evaluate what I'm seeing. What are some of the things to start with? Some of the types of media that are out there. You can kind of start where you'd like, but
Yeah.
what does that look like?
Well, as I detail in the book, I start out, I think the first thing people need to understand, and we've touched on this, is what are, we all have our biases, right, toward issues, right? And that's fine. But I have a chapter on basically just boils down to, when we react to a piece of media, that we understand that we're reacting to it and that before we share it, am I feeling a negative reaction, a positive reaction? If it's super negative or super positive and it's on a controversial topic, it's probably best to evaluate it first because that's a flag that if I'm feeling this emotional about something, it may be designed to trigger that, and maybe it's not completely accurate. And so I talk a little bit about that. And then I talk a little bit about what the information and social and media landscape looks like and where social media fits into that. And that's just for context, we have data, and then the biggest universe is data, right? And then we have information, and then it drills down to, well, the subset of information is, entertainment or which some people consider to be news. So I drill down a little bit with a Venn diagram, but that's just for context. And then I get into what visuals, all the visuals that we see out in social media, because that's what draws our eye. And what is a video trying to communicate to us, or a photo, or an image, right? I argue that those things, we shouldn't just rely on images, right? And most social media posts most of the times I have an image with a little caption, right, that explains what it is. And especially on X, right, you can't really say what it is in the short space that you have. So, but I talk about how image can't really make an argument, and I get into that and everything later in the book. But so I talk about photos, I talk about videos, I talk about memes, and memes are favorites of, especially of young people. They're, usually funny images and usually have text on top that make some kind of a social or political statement, right?
Mhm.
And they spread like wildfire and then people add to it. And there's usually an in group, right, that gets the meme and then people add on to it and then it evolves and more people pick it up. So, and those are all well and good, but they're not exactly reliable, right? They're usually distorted and there's no way to know who created the meme to start with. So, but because they're so prevalent, have a chapter on that. And then I get into advertisements, right? And that's where we're definitely the product for revenue purposes. And just sort of ads can be embedded to look in news so that they look like they're news. And sometimes you're supposed to see like the little word advertisement in tiny letters there, but because we're so busy, we often blow by that. I do, and I'm like, wow, this is related to a news article I'm reading. Oh, but it's an ad if I notice it in time, right? So I talk about ads, and then charts and graphs and things are often used. And those can be, they're made up of data, but they can, be made to say one thing or another. Chart makers can do all kinds of things. And
Mhm.
so I talk about charts and how they're manipulated. And then I get into just fact checking, right? And how to fact check. And I move into artificial intelligence, a big topic now. Although I would argue that artificial intelligence, you can avoid or you can evaluate it a lot of the same tools you use to evaluate any other media, but there are some special things, right? And it's very difficult now to tell what is AI and what isn't. Very hard. And I read an article the other day that many experts are saying you have to assume now that whatever video you're looking at, or probably even every image, is could be AI unless you can verify that it isn't. Now, that doesn't mean it's inaccurate, it's not worth sharing. It just means that you have to be very careful that it's not portraying a Hollywood actor is saying or doing something they didn't do, that kind of thing.
Right.
Right. And then I get into argumentation, that kind of thing, and how to spot an argument. And that's a pretty in-depth section there, which I find very important for people to do. Not taught too much in schools. And I think English teachers would find that because I think argumentation is not so much taught anymore in English classes the way that I advocated being taught. So, and then I talk about manipulation tactics and fallacies and that kind of thing. And then it ends up with just some practice, right? Looking at social media posts and evaluating them. I start with pop culture because that's what students like, right? So you can evaluate a Taylor Swift meme as easily as you can article from, ABC News on the war in Ukraine. It's the same sort of skill sets. But I recommend that people, especially teachers of teenagers, that they might be able to hook them a little quicker if they start with a Taylor Swift meme or something like that. The skills are the same, just the content. So I hope that those are some skills at the 30,000 foot view that I
Yeah.
think that I used a lot of this in when I worked at CIA, and I think it was very useful.
How important is a foundation of logic to this? I mean, in kind of being able to really use these skills to evaluate, to have a rationale around what something is, why it would be, what the motivations might be, right? I mean, because I don't think that the underlying lesson here is just don't believe anything, right? You have to be appropriately skeptical. You have to be open. But I'm sure you wouldn't have been very good at your job as a CIA analyst if you just landed on everything is fake. None of the information's real. None of it's true, right? That would be
Yeah.
just as bad as believing everything. So, how do people approach this in a way that they are open to understanding, what, this image that seemed really compelling and actually is AI. So it's not legitimate. At the same time, this information that maybe I was not predisposed to like or
Mhm.
believe, yeah, it's true, right? I'm convinced, and that part almost is, it almost to me in some ways feels more important right now, the willingness to undergo the evaluation process and to be convinced of the legitimacy of something that goes against our predispositions, or right, and to be able to do that, also understanding that there are, that the prevalence of stuff like doctored images and videos and AI also can become this catch-all excuse for that Hollywood actor who actually was caught in a compromising photo, right? Say, oh, that must have been AI, must have, right?
Yeah.
And or worse, of course, from more powerful and different sources, but that if we're not willing to undergo the process and really say, no, all the evidence is there that this is what it looks like, and this does show what it shows, that, if we're just in a state of chaos in the sense of nothing, nothing can be trusted, nothing's legitimate, then it's probably no better than everybody just believing everything.
No, yes, a good point, Russ. Yeah, if we're so cynical that we tune out and disbelieve everything, then it's just as bad because we're not we don't become informed citizens, right? And the truth is out there, as they say. And you know, there are different outlets or different platforms include they elect to leave things out, right? They have to make choices, especially in short form like X on X. But even the reputable news outlets that use journalistic standards, they cannot put everything in their post, right? So they have to make choices. And they make mistakes, but I think that, a lot of times now people are, especially younger people, are not watching or not listening or not consuming mainstream news from mainstream news outlets, meaning, CNN or Fox News or MSNBC. And I think those outlets do profess to adhere to journalistic standards. And I think that whereas your influencers may not. Some do, right? But many don't because they have no incentive to do that. And so I think that we need to slow down and we need to, if we need to make sure our biases are in check. We may dislike intensely a politician, and yet they may do something that well, they actually did something that I agree with. Or we love this politician who did something I can't stand. And we may, there's a thing called confirmation bias, tending to believe anything that confirms what we already think about something, preconceived notions about something. And likewise, we disregard any information that might conflict with that. So I think that's a battle that we all face.
Yeah.
I don't think that we're asking or that it's even possible for people to get rid of biases. In fact, journalists will tell you that it's impossible to be unbiased in the sense that they can't include everything and that there's context left out in some cases. So I think we all have to acknowledge we're all biased. I'm biased, listeners are biased. It's just recognizing it and trying to battle through it and say, hey, I have some humility here. And I have to say that there was evidence here that this politician did X, and I think it's great. you know?
Yeah.
And so it's having humility and then having the skills then to actually go ahead and evaluate the media as objectively as you possibly can.
Yeah. And I do think that there's like I guess, a concept of trying to get to the core of something's its reason for being, right? Like you reference memes. Like the reason for memes to really exist is to entertain, to make you laugh a little bit, or sometimes it's to seemingly communicate an interesting insight, in brevity. And but if you investigate it, there's a lot more to it, right? But a lot of times they get passed around as like, isn't this such a true statement? And it's like on its surface, it feels true, but it's also an oversimplification of something, or even, media outlets, your Substack blogs, these type of things where again, they may have actual journalists. They may do good coverage. The things that they cover and investigate may be well done, but you also have to understand their reason for being, because some of them, their founding principle is support of or opposition to a certain political movement, right? And so you have to understand that, and you might say, look, this is a good source for me to inform myself because I'm in alignment with the ideology here or whatever it is. However, I'm not going to use that as a source to share with somebody else that I'm trying to convince of my viewpoint, because they can dismiss it out of hand and say, well, they're biased, right? And so it's, I need to choose a different source for that, or I need to, go ahead and understand that as an individual, my credibility is tied up in the information that I share is credible, right? So if there's, again, some of these things are difficult to talk about generically, but there's certain things that are occurring, and there may be a lot of legitimate incidents of whatever it is. But if I'm going to share a particular story, I still need to look into that story and make sure the one that I'm reading, the facts add up and there isn't some other information, because once I share that, If I share it with someone and in fact it's not what it appears to be, then I've lost credibility for the other ones that maybe the facts do add up, right? It requires each time really being thoughtful of my I do once I endorse the information in
Hmm.
some way, maybe that social media, I guess it was the old Twitter line, retweets are not endorsements, like was
Yeah.
really not a good principle, right? Because it allows everybody to say, I didn't write it, I didn't do it. But we can just share things around and say, well, it's not, I just thought it was interesting, or I'm just
Yeah.
sharing it, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's perfectly fine to say you know, I find this interesting or entertaining. I don't necessarily, it's for entertainment purposes. I don't think it's accurate, But who wants to say that, right? It takes all the fun out of a lot of the culture is sharing entertainment, and who cares if it's true? But I think that if we get in the habit of that, then we don't stop when it really matters. We don't distinguish between it. We're starting to share everything. And so I think we just need to be careful. I'm not trying to spoil the party, right? With memes are fun to share around and the cat videos, I love those. And no harm done, right? The danger is if that becomes a habit. And so I think just we need to be mindful of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and there obviously is of course a difference in the stakes of what the news is about and what it pertains to, right? There's listeners who get angry at a sports podcast for being critical of the team. And it's like, well, this show is an analysis of the team and their performance. So they're going to say what's good. You can listen to a fan podcast that is meant to just be supportive if you want, and you can choose,
Yeah.
and that's being a sports fan, and ultimately like the stakes are low. You can choose what you like. If you want the thing that's more informative, if you want the thing that is more partial, that's up to you. Same thing with if it's about movies or television. Don't get angry at a film critic for being critical of a film that you like. That's one perspective. You have your own. You can find another analysis of it to read that's more positive if you want to. Ultimately, it's up to you what you
Yeah.
choose to pursue. But then when it goes into, of course, issues around, democracy and society and the economy and all of those types of issues, then it's oftentimes, I think, people can try to apply the same principles, which can lead to some issues. Also, I'm
Hmm.
curious even what it means, right? When people say they're consuming less news or watching less news, like how they define that. Like you said, students saying I get my news from TikTok, right? So does it
Yeah.
mean I'm not reading the newspaper? Does it mean I'm not on social media? Does it mean I'm not watching CNN? Right?
Yeah.
What do people mean when they say I'm consuming less news?
Well, I think, yeah, some of the surveys from Pew Research in particular have cited a high percentage of young people on TikTok. Well, and getting news, right? But yeah, what is news, And I think younger folks, teens and so forth, and even into the 20s would define news as things, not hard news, right? Not things like, The Economist or something about, let's take the war in Ukraine or Gaza or something. They view that news, but that's sort of hard news they call it, or I forget the term. But then there's the broader thing they call news, which is entertainment, like quite
Mhm.
sort of infotainment, if you will. So what's Taylor Swift doing today? What's Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift up to today? They would say that's news, and that's fine. I think you can define it broadly. It's informative and that kind of thing. But so I think that people, when you look at those surveys, you take them with a grain of salt too, because it depends on how they're defining the news. But ultimately, it doesn't matter so much. I think it matters that because the skills will be the same if you know how to evaluate it and make sure you're not sharing things that you haven't looked at closely and you're not sure about and it's controversial. That's all I'm advocating, that we say, wait a minute, I'm not going to share this, even though I know it's got to be true. I'm not going to share it because I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah. Based
Yeah.
on your experience with this, are there certain things that today's students, Gen Z, younger people are better at or more challenged by with respect to media literacy. Of course, they're native to these platforms, so I'm sure there's certain ways in which that benefits them. They're quick to spot certain things and they understand it. I'm sure there's other ways in which it removes some of the context that they need to learn in order to go about evaluating.
Well, I advocate that, and I don't obviously, I mean, I did it when I worked at CIA. I advocate for creating media. That's how you learn what accurate media is and what isn't if you have to create it yourself. And that's what they are very good at. Students, teenagers, and so forth, and young adults are very good at creating media. They're not so good at navigating it or evaluating what's already created, but I think they're very good at creating it. And you can learn a lot from, you know, you realize, oh, I can make some really inaccurate media if I want to, or I can use Chat GPT or DALL-E or Sora, one of these new platforms, generative AI platforms to create all kinds of things. But I think that, it's something that people just have to be aware of. But I think they're very good at doing it. I think young people are very good at creating those things and feel very comfortable using them to create things. So these chatbots and video creation, AI tools, I think they're very good at that. And I think that teachers should do that. I think they should encourage them to make media because I think they'll learn what good media is and what bad media is just by going through it. It's like a doctor, I guess. To be a medical doctor, you have to look at sick people and you look at well people, and I think the same applies.
Do you feel like, so for a teacher who is maybe not super confident in teaching this, do you feel like they can basically follow along with the book? Are there things that they should be thinking about or diving into to make sure that they feel, really confident to step into teaching students through media literacy?
Yeah, well, I think that, that's why I recommend that they start out with some pop culture topics because I think that's engaging for students. In fact, they can often ask the students, well, what do you want to evaluate? They know better than teachers would, or at least some teachers. And so I think you can start there, and then I think, but I don't advocate, I don't advocate staying there. I think you need to dive right into well, let me back up. I think that's teaching civics. And you say, well, it's not a core competency in social studies. Well, no, but civics. And sometimes these pop culture topics can overlap with social studies topics. But then I think you need to, you can use it to teach core, social studies topics, U.S. history or whatever it is. You'll find plenty of media, social media out there on that stuff, especially when holidays come up. I have a calendar in the book, and I keep my own calendar of social studies events or holidays, and a lot of them are social studies informed topics. You can use them as markers or as occasions to then introduce a social media topic. You know, you can find plenty on Thanksgiving, for instance, the pilgrims, you can find them on, then you can move into Super Bowl ads. When January comes around for the NFL Super Bowl, there'll be plenty of ads. And so I think these don't have to be controversial topics politically, but I don't think they should shy away either. I think they can get topics from a variety of political viewpoints, and the skills will be the same. Let students evaluate them and come up to their own conclusions about them. As long as they're gathering the evidence to the extent the sources that are behind these memes or behind the post. If there's evidence to support it, great. You don't, and whether they agree with it or not, is the evidence there and does it make an argument that's convincing? So I don't think they should shy away from it. I think if you're picking a variety of topics and letting students pick some of them, at least in the beginning, I think that'll go a long way to making it something that'll be useful and shouldn't be too intimidating.
Yeah. It feels like anybody, even one who is pretty skilled, pretty informed at this, that in order to do it and to do it effectively, you have to be willing to risk being wrong from time to time, right? And then recognize that, correct it, admit it. But in order to do the task of really engaging with media and information and, video and all these things that are out there and really trying to determine its credibility, its accuracy, its message, etc., that from time to time there may be one that you just don't quite get right, or that is later disproven, or whatever the case may be, but that you can't you can't really do it, and you probably won't teach it or learn it if you're not willing to really engage with it. If you keep it at a distance, or you
Yeah.
only engage with the really easy ones, or whatever it may
Right.
be, that you can't really do it well if you're not willing to understand that it is challenging.
Yes, and I think teachers should be upfront with students that, you know, this is new skills. These are new skills for everybody, and they can practice the skills along with the students, right? I mean, I'm going to be presenting at the National Council of Social Studies in DC in December, and I'm going to be going over some of these skills, trying to get teachers, because it'll be teachers mainly there, to start trying to use some of these things. So I think you got to start somewhere, right? And it is intimidating. I was intimidated writing the book because
Yeah.
I didn't, I had a CIA background on how to evaluate media, but a lot of the newer technologies, since I retired, even the way AI has just exploded and the new tools, I have a hard time keeping up. But I think the skills remain the same, right? Looking for evidence. It can be a convincing video, but okay, let's go see what other media, what other outlets are talking about this video, or if they're not talking about it, well, it might not be real, right? It
Yeah.
might be just made up for that platform or that post. So, but it is intimidating, and I find it very challenging. But I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to pursue if we're going to keep our democracy and keep people informed rather than cynical.
No. If there's one thing that listeners can remember from the conversation, what would you pull out for them?
Oh, gosh, one thing I would pull out. I think that anyone can learn these skills. I mean, you don't have to be a teenager to learn them,
Mm.
right? You don't have to be a teacher of social studies. Anyone can. But I would say that democracy really is, I don't want to put too fine a point on it. I think democracy is at risk if we don't have a civic engagement, and that comes from being well informed. And because we're on social media so much and there's so much out there, I think we really have to learn these skills if we're going to save our democracy. I really think it's that important. If we let AI do all the work for us and sit back, where are we? Right? We're not,
Right.
we're losing our critical thinking skills if we let ChatGPT do our homework, right? It's okay to analyze data with it. But anyway, my point is that our democracy will be threatened if we don't get better at this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in other cases of thinking big chick picture, probably about incentives, and an anti-democratic force would be disincentivized from having people be informed. You don't want people to notice what you're doing, to pick up on when you're not necessarily giving them honest information, or when you're manipulating things. And so it really requires an informed populace, people who are take it upon themselves, and as individuals and as a society, to really want to understand information and what's out there, and to have a common understanding, I guess, which is the most difficult thing in the fragmented media and social media landscape of today, is that we could be absorbing completely different information with no overlap if we don't make sure that we are going out and seeking and understanding, what are other people seeing, what are they learning about, how do I relate to that, how does that inform what I know. But it truly can be, completely polarized in that sense, if everybody just sticks to what they know and doesn't think critically about some of these issues.
Yeah.
So you also have your website, medialiteracysleuth.com. I figure that's another place you might want people to check out. But what can listeners find on that website? Is there anything else you want to direct them to?
Well, the website what I do there is I periodically, not a particular schedule, I will upload evaluations of social media posts. I try to do a few every so often. I'm going to try to start doing a few more frequently. But yeah, I apply the skills and I just do fresh content. And I try to pick pop culture topics. I try to pick social studies, civics type topics. So they can go there and learn that. I also tell a little bit about where I'm going to be speaking. So I have to put that up there. It's not there yet. I'll be speaking like I said, at the National Council of Social Studies conference here in DC here, December 5th and 6th. I'll be there on the 6th. And then I have a page for my book. So you can find the book on Amazon if you're interested. And yeah, that's the point of the website and /blog.
Excellent. Well, listeners, you can check that out. We'll put the link below. It's medialiteracysleuth.com if you want to read some of what's on there, some of the analyses of pop culture topics and other media that you might use in your classroom. If you're a teacher, you might share them with anybody that you're working with, any students, young people in your lives. You also can find the book, Teaching Media Literacy with Social Media News from Routledge Eye on Education. We'll put the link to that below as well, or you can find it wherever you get your books. If you have not already, please do subscribe to The Authority for more interviews coming your way every week. And if you're enjoying the show, we really do appreciate those 5-star Apple, Spotify reviews wherever you're listening. They help new listeners find the show. So all of that is there for you. We'll put the links below, make it easy for you. My guest today is Roy Whitehurst. Roy, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.